Welcome back to the Word Room. We are going from chapter to chapter through the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, breaking down a summary of the chapter, some key takeaways, and looking at what it tells us about God. Today, Genesis chapter 21, God finally brings about the promise of the seed of Abraham. You don't want to miss this. Let's go. All right, let's jump right into our summary of Genesis chapter 21. So in this chapter, as promised, Sarah has a son named Isaac through a miracle. The Bible actually says that it is God who visits or comes upon Sarah to give her the son Isaac. And Abraham names him Isaac as God commanded in the previous chapters. Now, Isaac was circumcised on the 8th day as a sign of the covenant. In the previous chapters, we saw that God made a covenant with Abraham and commanded him to circumcise all the male children. They did that on the 8th day after birth. Ishmael, who was around 15 or 16 years old at the time, so it's been some time has passed. He would have been around 15 to 16 years old. He mocked Isaac. Now, he didn't just mock Isaac. The idea is that he was mocking Isaac and the idea of the promise. They were celebrating Isaac. Sarah, after he was weaned, was throwing a big feast, and it was a big celebration for Isaac. And Ishmael, probably with some jealousy, because they were making a big deal that this was the promised child, began to mock Isaac, and there was some contention there, some issue there. Sarah has Ishmael and Hagar sent away. So she has them sent away. She's done this before, right? But now she's doing it again, but this time God allows them to leave. God actually tells Abraham, go ahead and send them away, but God ends up preserving them on that journey. And then at the end of the chapter, there's this story about Abraham and Abimelech making a treaty and covenant, and we'll see that in just a moment. So some key takeaways from this chapter. Number one, God brought about the promise of a son for Abraham and Sarah after years of delay. Now, it's been years and years and years since the original promise that God would make Abraham a father of many nations. It's been a long time. And yet, even through all of that, they've been faithful and trusted God, even though we saw in the last chapter they made mistakes, they committed sins, they were not perfect, but they still trusted and believed God, and God brought about the promise after much delay. It's very important to understand that delay is not denial, that just because God made a promise and it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean God's not faithful to his promise. God will speak things or God will show things and you haven't experienced it yet. But just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean you won't. There is an important part of walking with God that is the concept of persevering or being faithful and having patience while we wait upon the Lord. Very, very important principle. Abraham and Sarah had laughed at the promise. So God finally brings about the promise. They had laughed at that promise, but now it says God made Sarah laugh joyfully. So it's funny because it's when God first told Abraham about this, Abraham laughed. Then later he reiterates the promise to Abraham. Sarah is listening, and she laughs internally, and God kind of calls her out on it. Now God is making Sarah laugh joyfully. It's almost like this abundance of joy from the Lord that hits her when she has Isaac. And I think it's hilarious. It's basically almost as if God gets the last laugh, right? So they laughed because they thought it would be impossible. It didn't make sense to them. Now God, through Sarah, bringing joy and laughing, almost like a joyful last laugh from the Lord. Number two, Ishmael was 13 to 14 years old when Isaac was born. And Ishmael mocked Isaac and the promise when Isaac was weaned, which would have been probably about 2 years later. So Ishmael would have been about 15 to 16 years old at this point. And this caused Sarah to want Hagar and Ishmael gone. Now, why? He's mocking Isaac. Now, again, he's not just mocking Isaac as in just making fun of him like children do. It's more the concept that he is mocking the promise, that there's a root of jealousy there, that Isaac's the promised child and Ishmael's not. And so he recognizes that. So there's this contention, and Sarah doesn't want Isaac to be fighting for position or for the promise or for, fighting for that inheritance, fighting for that name of being the one that became the seed of Abraham, that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through. She didn't want Ishmael fighting with Isaac over that. So she sees this and she recognizes this is going to be an issue. So she sends Hagar and Ishmael away. Now she initially goes to Abraham. Abraham doesn't want to do it because he loves his son Ishmael. Earlier when Ishmael was first born, they sent Hagar away, but that was early on. This is now 15 to 16 years later. Abraham has developed a close relationship with his son. So obviously he doesn't want to send Ishmael away, but God tells him, go ahead and do it, and I promise you I'll take care of them. So Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away with a promise that God would take care of them. Hagar and Ishmael run out of water, so Abraham sends them with water, and they run out of water to the point that they think that Ishmael's going to die. So Hagar thinks Ishmael's going to die. He must be weak from dehydration. She puts him under a bush. He can barely move on his own, and she goes away from him pretty far distance away because she didn't want to actually just watch her son die. So she leaves him there, which is kind of a messed up way of thinking, but different culture. But then the angel of the Lord, which we saw showed up to Hagar before, and we recognize that was the pre-incarnate Jesus, pre-incarnate Christ, shows up to Hagar again, and it says he talks to her, he comforts her, and then he opens her eyes to a water source. Now, we don't know exactly what this means. My guess would be that there wasn't a well there, and God made one appear, because we know that it's not just that she wasn't blind. She was walking around, she was traveling, so she could have clearly seen that a water source was there if she had been looking. My guess is either A, she wasn't looking and he just kind of revealed to her where it was, or B, God made one appear, which is probably what a lot of theologians and scholars agree upon. So God makes this water source supernaturally or miraculously appear for her. And then he promised that Ishmael would be a great nation. So because it's Abraham's seed as well, God still took care of that and promised he's going to make Ishmael a great nation as well. They become the Arab people. Then Abimelech in this chapter, at the end of this chapter, Abraham makes a covenant with Abimelech. Abimelech is a Philistine king, and it's probably not the same king from chapter 20. Abimelech was actually a title, which means my father is king or father king. It was not a name necessarily. So there are a few Abimelechs throughout scripture related to the Philistines, and it's more than likely just a title. So this is a different Philistine king in the land of Canaan based on what we can tell. And Abraham then makes a peace covenant with this Philistine king and sets up an altar to worship God in a pagan land. So he worships the one true God in a pagan land. So 5 things this tells us about God. Number 1, God works in his timing. That God made this promise about Isaac a long time ago, and in his timing, he brought about Isaac. Not when Abraham and Sarah wanted Isaac, but from the beginning, God had a set time in which he was going to bring about the promise. God works in his timing, not ours. Number 2, he honors his word even in our sin. God promised that the seed of Abraham would become a great nation. Ishmael is part of the seed of Abraham, not the promised seed, but part of the seed of Abraham. And God honored his word that he would make Abraham's seed a great nation, and that would include Ishmael. And he honors that even though Ishmael was born out of a result of Abraham's sin. Number 3, he loves those not in the covenant too. Hagar was not in the covenant. She was a pagan from Egypt. She wasn't a part of the covenant that God was making with the established people that would become the nation of Israel. But he loved her. And he showed up to her and he comforted her and he gave her healing and he gave her miracles and met with her. Why? Because God isn't here just for those who accept him. He loves everyone and he's here for the whole world. Number 4, God does not change. He does not change. Even though he loves Ishmael, he loves Hagar. His plan was that Isaac would be the promised seed, and he does not change that. He blesses Ishmael. He makes Ishmael a great nation, but he does not change his plan. He doesn't allow our actions to dictate his. It was his plan for Isaac to be the promised seed. It will remain his plan for Isaac to be the promised seed, and he will not change. And number 5, God is everlasting, eternal. We know this because God, when he builds an altar, Abraham builds an altar to worship God, he says, the everlasting God, that he is eternal, everlasting, from eternity past to eternity future, which means he's outside of time. Hope you got something out of this. 5 things we learned about God. Go dig deeper into this chapter. Comment down below, like, and subscribe. Until next time.